So in this video, we're going to talk about Book 8 of Plato's Republic. Now, for my purposes, this is probably the most important book in the Republic, because I'm working on a book about how contemporary adapters utilize Greek drama to promote democracy in the modern world. And Book 8 is where Socrates picks up what he had originally intended to do in Book 5, which is to talk about the 4 different types of constitutions that exist in city-states, apart from the kallipolis that they have been theorizing throughout the Republic itself. So, the book begins with a brief summary of what they've decided, particularly throughout Book 7, but really throughout the previous several books, about the way that the kallipolis, or the ideal city, should function. So we get that right from the beginning, this sort of summary of the key things involved in that city. But then we have, again, that return to this earlier idea that Socrates had wanted to talk through, that there are 4 different types of constitutions. And he says here, first, there's the constitution praised by most people, namely the Cretan or Laconian. And this is what he later calls timocracy, or a sort of military rule, not necessarily in the sense of a military dictatorship, but in the sense of a society run by warriors who are dedicated to accruing honor as a positive value. The second, which is also second in the praise it receives, is called oligarchy and is filled with a host of evils. The next in order and antagonistic to it is democracy. And finally, there is genuine tyranny, surpassing all of them, the 4th and last of the diseased cities. So these are the 4 different constitutions Socrates is going to talk about in this book. But he also says here, and do you realize that of necessity, there are as many forms of human character as there are of constitutions? Or do you think that constitutions are born from rock or oak, and not from the characters of the people who live in the cities governed by them, which tip the scales, so to speak, and drag the rest along with them? So essentially, what he talks about in Book 8 is that there are these 4 different types of constitutions that reflect 4 different types of human souls, or 4 different characteristics that people might have. And so this is essentially what he discusses. He sets out, in effect, to categorize these 4 different types of constitutions and the types of people that they reflect. Now, one question does come up, and it's interesting that this question is what starts this idea. Because essentially the question arises before the categorization begins of how city-states descend from the kallipolis to timocracy, to oligarchy, to democracy, and finally to tyranny. It's an interesting assumption that you have that sort of downward momentum from the ideal. This is a Platonic idea, really, because the kallipolis is the sort of ideal form of the city-state, right? And Plato is very interested in the idea of ideal forms. That is, the perfect version of something that exists on some plane, some like perfect idealized plane, whereas all really existing versions of anything are imperfect forms. So the assumption here seems to be that the kallipolis is the ideal form and everything else degenerates. Every other constitution is a degenerate form of the constitution before it. What's really striking about this way of proceeding is that it has no relationship whatsoever to actual history or the actual sort of evolution of societies. I mean, there's there's a theoretical way in which this might be right, but in terms of like actual observable human history and sociology, it's completely wrong. So that's worth noting. But the other thing that's striking about this theory of a society's degeneration, basically Socrates says here, the reason that the kallipolis will fall is because at some point, out of imperfect knowledge, the inability to completely identify the best children, society will promote people who are less worthy. The descendants of the philosopher kings, at some point there will be bad genes in there, and there'll be less perfect philosopher kings, etc., etc. So essentially what he says here is that the eugenics program that Socrates is so gung-ho about, especially in Book 5, where he talks about wives and children being owned in common and raised in common, and this like breeding program built on infanticide, he acknowledges here that that is doomed to fail. It is an untenable system. So that's a really striking thing. The eugenics, the idea of we can breed the best rulers in order to ensure the maximum benefit for the city as a whole, the fact that that is doomed to fail is really striking. But what he says, essentially, is that when that happens, when the eugenics program collapses and you start getting inferior people running the city-state, you will end up with civil war. And out of that civil war, you will get timocracy. Again, this military rule run by people who love honor, love victory, and primarily are motivated by a desire to be successful in battle, for conquest. The Homeric kings, people like Agamemnon, Achilles, Ajax, Odysseus, might fall into this camp. So timocracy for Socrates, and presumably for Plato, is the second best constitution after the kallipolis. It's a system in which honor is still central, in which things that are basically good are valued, but the best things, the love of wisdom, the love of truth, the pursuit of knowledge that the philosopher kings make central to their rule, those things are no longer as important, or in some cases no longer even tolerated in the timocracy. What you get after the timocracy is a descent into oligarchy. And basically what happens is that because in the timocracy honor is the highest commodity, when a father loses honor in one way or another, Socrates says that his son will cling to the next best thing, the next best way to get recognition, which is money. And so as that son shifts his values from the honor and glory, the kudos in Greek of his father's value system, to a financial value system, you go from timocracy to oligarchy. And essentially what he says about oligarchy is the constitution based on a property assessment in which the rich rule and the poor man has no share in ruling. And basically this is his definition of oligarchy. It's rule by the wealthy. And one of the problems with this, apart from the fact that the love of money is itself not an admirable trait to Socrates, one of the problems is that he says that of necessity it isn't one city but two, one of the poor and one of the rich, living in the same place and always plotting against one another. So, as opposed to the kallipolis, in which everyone sort of remains in their rightful place, doing what's expected of them and contributing to the general good of society, because that maximizes their happiness. In the oligarchy, the rich are set against the poor. Each group has a radically different set of interests, and those interests are mutually exclusive, right? And we see this today in oligarchic societies. Russia, for instance, is an oligarchic society to a significant extent. The US, to a certain extent, is oligarchic, even though we maintain many of the trappings of representative democracy. The needs of the wealthy and the needs of powerful corporations are disproportionately represented, etc., etc. And those needs are often at odds with the needs of the majority of people. So this is the issue that you have in oligarchy, according to Socrates. So, I mean, all the way back in Plato's day, he knew these kinds of issues that we're still dealing with today. And what happens is that out of that conflict, you eventually get the transition to democracy, according to Socrates. Because basically what happens is that at some point, according to the Republic, the poor realize that they are numerically superior and physically stronger than the rich, because the rich have so much privilege and luxury and just general sort of, I don't know, sitting on cushions and eating grapes and whatever kind of stuff you did if you were an ancient Greek oligarch. Whereas the poor are constantly working, so they're muscular and whatever it is. Essentially, at some point, the poor realize that it would be very, very easy for them to defeat the rich and take all their stuff and distribute it amongst the poor. And so he says here, I suppose that democracy comes about when the poor are victorious, killing some of their opponents and expelling others, and giving the rest an equal share in ruling under the Constitution, and for the most part assigning people to positions by rule of lot. And that was actually the way that democracy worked in ancient Athens, was civic responsibility, even military responsibility, jury duty, etc., etc., was generally assigned by lot, which meant that every citizen, and it's important to remember that citizens were men, free, property owning, and at some point, citizenship in Athens was restricted to people who had two citizen parents. So if one of your parents was a foreigner or one of your parents had been a slave, then you were no longer a citizen of Athens. But anyway, so the idea here is essentially poor people will realize that it's fairly easy for them to defeat the limited number of rich people and to take all of their stuff. And what Socrates essentially says is the defining characteristic of democracy, or the ultimate good for democracy, is freedom. Now, he is not necessarily a big fan of this, in part because, in a way that to modern Americans, for instance, seems very counterintuitive, freedom for Socrates is not a good thing. Now, I mean, if you think about the nature of the kallipolis, it's an extraordinarily regimented society in which everyone has a specific set of responsibilities. That is all that they are allowed to do, all that they are encouraged to do, and any attempt that they make to do anything other than what their narrow social and economic cultural responsibility is regarded as a major transgression. That being said, Socrates' understanding of democratic freedom is something more akin to anarchy than it is to how democracies actually work. Basically, he argues, so he says here, I suppose that when a democratic city, a thirst for freedom, happens to get bad cupbearers for its leaders so that it gets drunk by drinking more than it should of the unmixed wine of freedom, then unless the rulers are very pliable and provide plenty of that freedom, they are punished by the city and accused of being accursed oligarchs. There's a response here. I think this is Glaucon, but it may be Adamantius. But I think Glaucon is back to answering at this point. It doesn't really make any difference. Whoever it is Socrates is talking to, their job is basically just to say, yes, you're right, Socrates. He says, it insults those who obey the rulers as willing slaves and good-for-nothings and praises and honors both in public and in private, rulers who behave like subjects and subjects who behave like rulers. And isn't it inevitable that freedom should go to all lengths in such a city? Of course. It makes its way into private households and in the end breeds anarchy even among the animals. So Socrates' conception of freedom in a democracy is basically that everybody can do whatever they want. There's absolutely no rules. Nobody has any responsibilities to anybody else. Anybody who tries to claim that someone else has some kind of responsibility is seen as a tyrant or an oligarch. And basically this is complete anarchy. He says even the laws people don't obey. Again, in reality, this has very little to do with how democracies actually worked, either in ancient Greece, where there were a wide range of democratic constitutions across various city-states and across various centuries, or in the modern world. There are no democracies that function the way that Socrates claims that democracies function. So this is the view of someone who is ideologically opposed to democracy, and from the perspective of a Democrat, from the perspective of someone who looks for actual evidence in the real world, this is an extraordinarily flimsy case, in my opinion. But what Socrates argues, is that democracy ultimately descends into tyranny because it's so anarchic, so free. There are no rules, no guidance, and everybody's just running around crazy, doing whatever kind of crazy shit they want with no consequences, that eventually people are going to be like, this kind of sucks. We want to massively overreact, so let's find somebody who wants a massive amount of power, and we will put that person in charge. And so from there, he says you descend from democracy into tyranny. And while there's a little bit of description of tyranny at the end of Book 8, the discussion of the constitution of the tyrannical man and how that reflects in the tyrannical city-state actually gets pushed to Book 9. But the last thing I do want to say about Book 8, toward the end of this book, Socrates claims that, he says, then surely since the tragic poets are wise, they'll forgive us and those whose constitutions resemble ours, if we don't admit them into our city, since they praise tyranny. He makes this argument that tragic playwrights, especially Euripides, who he names specifically here, are pro-tyrannical. Which, if you read Greek drama, is a really peculiar claim. When you look at a play like Eumenides, by Aeschylus, the third play of the Oresteia trilogy. This is about how Athena divinely institutes the jury system that was central to Athenian democracy. In in the Suppliants, we have a similar thing. Democracy is praised as the alternative to Egyptian autocracy. We have these examples throughout the surviving canon of Greek tragedy. We've lost a massive amount of it. To be fair, it's entirely possible that a lot of what didn't survive was praising tyrants. But I think it's very unlikely given the canon that we have. But what I do think has happened here is that, based on what Socrates says earlier in the Republic about the nature of art and the social function of art, I think he's unwilling or maybe even unable to distinguish between telling a story about something, even if it's a cautionary tale, and praising the subject of that story. So there are definitely Greek tragic plays in which tyrants rule, but it's very often, I can't think of a single example in Greek tragedy, and I've read all of the surviving plays, not all of the fragments that still exist, but I've read all of the translations of all of the surviving plays. I can't think of a single example where it's like, yes, I, the playwright, am clearly in support of tyrannic rulers. With the exception of Aristophanes, who is, of course, a comic playwright, who is pretty anti-democratic. But it's an interesting gesture that, to me, suggests that maybe Socrates/Plato doesn't know that much about the politics of Greek tragedy.